Scholar with New Forms Press, and today I'm here with Stephanie Mines. Scholar Hangout is an interview process where we just speak with other scholars in the industry, talking about their research and work and different things we can look forward to seeing in their research in the future. For those of you haven't met me yet, I'm Catherine Dollar. I am a digital marketing consultant based in Dallas. I have partnered with New Forms Press because they are interested in digital content contribution and distribution, which is why we have now launched Scholar Hangout. So I want to introduce today Stephanie Mines. She's a Ph.D. and her work and research centers around sensory integration. She has authored several books. Her latest is New Frontiers in Sensory Integration. She works with parents, educators, and care providers on how they can work with children coping with sensory disabilities. So Stephanie, thank you for joining us on Scholar Hangout.
It's my pleasure, Catherine.
Well, thank you so much. And, you know, I was reading over your book, and in speaking with you and getting to know you, you often refer to a case study about Sophie. And I was wondering if you could kind of share with us what is unique about Sophie's case study.
Well, first of all, I want to say that this is the perfect day to be having a discussion about Sophie because today is her 16th birthday. And later on today, I'm going to be celebrating that with her, so I'm super excited about that. So I chose Sophie to focus on in my book, New Frontiers in Sensory Integration, because Sophie has a really extreme case of autism combined with the attributes of Rett syndrome, which are extremely challenging because there's many rather spastic and habituated behaviors that limit the capacity of girls with Rett syndrome to have social interaction and learn with their peers. So Sophie has a constant activity in her hands for the most part, and she is nonverbal. So those attributes in particular are challenges in the educational and social environments. And then there are also some particular kinds of physiological conditions that are very typical to girls with Rett syndrome, such as respiratory difficulty. And in fact, the respiratory challenges can be quite severe and have been known to be fatal for some girls with Rett syndrome. So it's quite the challenging diagnosis.
Oh my gosh, that does sound really like an intense and very severe situation.
It is. It's a severe autistic diagnosis. And so because I have had so much incredible success with Sophie, I felt it was a very worthwhile case study to highlight the interventions that I'm recommending for parents and for caregivers, and Sophie has done so incredibly well, and we are going to be honoring her today at her 16th birthday party. And that birthday party
so amazing.
Celebrate all her incredible achievements.
How long have you been working with Sophie?
I have been working with Sophie since she was 8 years old.
Oh my gosh. So can you explain to us some of the improvements you've seen with Sophie over the years you've been working with her?
Yes, in fact, in the book, New Frontiers in Sensory Integration, I articulate 14 specific kinds of improvements that both I, her mom, and in addition the medical specialists who she works with and the other therapists who she works with, many of whom are going to be at her birthday party today, have also noted. And those improvements are on every level. So they're physiological. For instance, since I've been working with Sophie in these over 10 years, obviously, she has not had one single respiratory infection.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing because like you said, I mean, there's respiratory, you know, it's fatal for them, these respiratory issues that women or girls with Rett syndrome can have.
Yeah, she had one cold last year in the winter, but it never became a respiratory infection. So that's completely miraculous. So that is definitely something I want to highlight and make sure that other parents of girls with Rett syndrome are aware that that pattern of respiratory distress in girls with Rett syndrome can be alleviated. So Sophie's entire respiratory diaphragm is now much more relaxed, much softer, much more open, and much more available for breath. So her breathing is vastly improved. And the shortness of breath, which is very typical for girls with Rett, is hardly exists for Sophie at this juncture in her life.
That's so amazing. And it's amazing that we get to speak with you when you're about to go celebrate her birthday, her 16th birthday. So what do you, these 14 significant changes, what do you attribute these dramatic improvements in her sensory disorder?
Well, I would say that the interventions that I used clearly made a significant difference, but I also want to highlight the fact that her mom carried through with those interventions at home. And quite honestly, I believe that is what made the significant difference, is the way in which her mom began to use the interventions that I modeled for her and that I used with Sophie. Her mom replicated those interventions on every level in her private time with Sophie. So it's her mom's advocacy, her mom's devotion to really emphasizing Sophie's gifts over this very, very, very severe diagnosis. Her mom has been able to do the hands-on treatments that I have taught her, but it's not only the hands-on treatments, which are easy to learn. They're subtle treatments that are based on understanding the bioelectricity of the connective tissue of the human body and how that bioelectricity can be directed and enhanced through very subtle applied touch interventions. But in addition to that hands-on component, what Sophie's mom, and I am so grateful to her for noticing this, she noticed the way in which I interact with Sophie. So the way that I interact with Sophie, I call limbic stimulation. So what that phrase means is that in my interactions with her, I am using intelligent language. I'm not talking in baby talk simply because my client is nonverbal. I am assuming the intelligence of my client at all times, and I am recognizing the way in which Sophie responds to me. So despite the fact that she is nonverbal, she is clearly understanding what I am saying to her and clearly interacting with me in response. However, people might not notice her responses unless they were directed to them. And that's what her mom began to become aware of as she observed me interacting with Sophie, was that I was having a very clear dialogue with Sophie. And I enhanced that dialogue. I mirrored that dialogue back to Sophie. And that's really the definition of limbic stimulation. So the limbic brain is the relational brain. It's the brain that is more advanced than the primitive brain that responds to threat. It's the brain that, in fact, responds to social engagement, social interaction, as a way to address its learning process. So the brain becomes really like a playground, you know, responding to what's going on outside. And if the relationships in the world of that autistic young person, in this case Sophie, are dynamic relationships that are learning oriented, not making the assumption that the child does not understand simply because they're nonverbal, then that limbic brain begins to flourish. And we've seen the evidence of that because Sophie is now using an eye gaze device which allows her to communicate. And through the mechanisms of this eye gaze device, she is able to demonstrate that she understands and has always understood what the people around her are saying and doing.
That's amazing. Can you share, how is your method different from maybe other treatments or treatment options that parents might be coming across?
Well, I think the most unique attribute of the approach that I offer and that I describe in detail in New Frontiers in Sensory Integration is the applied touch methodology that parents can implement so easily. And that applied touch is, as I mentioned earlier, subtle. It has no contraindications. It has been clinically tested for children with autism, and the clinical trials showed that children who are repeatedly given the opportunity to experience this applied touch methodology advance significantly in terms of their learning and social engagement. So the applied touch system is similar to acupuncture, though of course it is much, much more gentle, so there's absolutely no invasive procedure involved, such as acupuncturists use with needles. This is simply the placing of hands very gently, and that touch can be varied according to the tolerance of the child on specific sites that are bioelectrical vortices, you might say. They're areas on the body that are highly charged bioelectrical sites that when they're stimulated, they send a message through connective tissue up the spinal column to relax the primitive brain and allow the limbic brain to be more receptive. So it's using really the afferent efferent nervous system of the body and the way in which connective tissue is a conductor of sensation. So this system is easily transmitted to parents so that they can replicate these treatments for very specific purposes at home. And one of the most remarkable things that has happened with Sophie, as I mentioned, the Rett syndrome is characterized by these obsessive hand movements. It's called hand clapping or hand wringing. Well, we have observed repeatedly that when Sophie is receiving the applied touch applications, the hand clapping and hand wringing ceases. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to create a situation in which that hand clapping ceases permanently, but it does cease for intervals anywhere between 5 to 15 or 20 minutes at a time, which is quite remarkable. So you can observe during those interludes in which the hand clapping is relaxed that Sophie's entire system relaxes in that opportunity, in that window of opportunity that she has to be less stressed. The hand clapping and the spasticity in her system is clearly physiologically extremely demanding for her. So she gets a break from that during the hands-on treatment. And there are actually some photos of that in my book, New Frontiers in Sensory Integration.
And all of this is because of the Rett syndrome, the symptoms of having this type of sensory integration disorder. So, but you're saying a lot of these methods would even work on other spectrums of sensory integration, such as autism, or can you give some examples of what other kind of situations that parents could use applied touch?
Absolutely, yes. Sophie is the most severe case that I've addressed. So I have definitely been able to transmit this system to children and parents with learning challenges, for instance, and I tell many of these case studies in my book. So children with dyslexia, children who are diagnosed with hyperactivity, children diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder, children who have visual difficulties, or children struggling with allergic reactions. The system is easily transmitted, and the children receive the treatments quite readily. I frequently incorporate the treatments with storytelling, which is another component of this limbic stimulation that I'm talking about. So again, limbic stimulation is using relationship. So the adult uses their relationship with the child in order to stimulate the child's learning and development. So the adult brain functions like an anchor for the instability or absence of sensory filtering that the child may be struggling with. So the adult is there to anchor the child in this brain-to-brain contact. So storytelling, which is so much fun and which I thoroughly enjoy, is a great way to anchor the child's brain. So when I integrate the storytelling with the hands-on application, the child just becomes incredibly receptive and we both have a great time.
That's wonderful, because I know from what it sounds like you're saying and sharing with us is that this is a way parents can really be on board with helping their child. I think a lot of people feel a little helpless, and they're going to doctors and from wherever you're, but there's this whole process of from when you're being diagnosed, and then you go through the research stage, and they feel kind of lost. And of course, what family member doesn't want to be there for their loved one that has a sensory dysfunction? But this is a way that parents can not only help, but actually really see results and be a part of the treatment, like in Sophie's case with her mother.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. When a child receives a diagnosis of some sensory processing disorder or autism or learning challenge, the parent goes through quite a series of responses. And in fact, I provide some support for that process because it has to be factored into the entire journey of living with a child with a sensory or learning challenge or a child who's on the autism spectrum. So the parent really benefits from having tools that allows them to engage proactively and as an advocate for the child, and to directly experience the way that the parent can intervene with the child's nervous system, with the child's sensory responses, and support the development of sensory filters that may not exist, that need certain kinds of intervention to be strengthened. And this is, of course, not a system that is in conflict with medical interventions or other learning interventions. This is a system that works as a friend with the other systems in an integrative way so that parents don't have to feel that it's an either-or situation. But as the parent engages in this direct contact and limbically with their child, they begin to see these really fine details of change that the child experiences, and they become really intimate with who the child is. And as a result, they have more ballast when they are in interaction with medical authorities, because medical authorities or even educational authorities will tend to be somewhat intimidating. The parent feels helpless, as you mentioned, and might feel less than the expert when they engage. And when the parent really has a direct experience with the child so that they understand their child and they're not sort of blinded by the diagnosis, which happens so easily, then the parent can truly be an advocate for the child, not again in conflict with the authorities who may be trying to be very helpful in directing the child's learning and social engagement, but in cooperation with them, offering their very highly educated assessment of their own child as a way to enhance the way that services are provided.
Stephanie, I'm so glad you point that out, because that was a question I have, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers have, is when we take an approach like yours, that it is complementary to other treatment options. It's not this or the other. It's something that just is complementary, and it helps all around. So what would you tell parents who want to advocate for their children, what are their first steps? And to bring in more awareness. We've talked about this before, and I loved what you had to say. So I'm excited for our viewers to hear how they can advocate for their children.
Well, I would say, first of all, for parents who receive a diagnosis, to allow themselves to go through the shock and process that within themselves and find their ground. And I give some really good guidelines for how to do that in my book. But then I would say the most important thing the parent really has to do is to see their child's gifts and not be blindsided by the diagnosis. Not disregarding the diagnosis, but seeing who the child is and not allowing the diagnosis to define who the child is. And then creating a way that the gifts of the child are emphasized over whatever the diagnosis implies. And Temple Grandin, who has made such a huge contribution in the world of autism, agrees heartily with me about this, that the way that you mentor your child through the process of dealing with a diagnosis like autism, for instance, is by sponsoring that child's gifts. And I devote a lot of time in my book to this concept of niche construction, or building a learning environment and a learning attitude at home that focuses on the gifts of the child. And I give multiple suggestions and resources for how parents and caregivers also in their therapeutic environment can build this niche construction that is directed at the gifts of the child. So when the parent is really advocating for the personhood of the child, then they can advocate in any environment, whether the child goes into a medical environment, for instance, when sometimes the child needs a surgical procedure. You know, you advocate for the personhood of that child, even though they may have physical limitations in that medical setting, and definitely in the educational environment and in the therapeutic environment as well. The parent becomes the voice of the child's gifts rather than the voice of the child's disabilities.
I love that. You say that so well. And for our viewers today, I want to let you know that Stephanie has agreed to supply a lot of resources on the New Forms Press website. She's going to have blogs, we're going to have other videos, and of course you are welcome to take a peek at her book, New Frontiers in Sensory Integration. So Stephanie, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure speaking with you. I'm learning about your newest research and work.
It goes both ways, Catherine, so I look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you, and make sure to tell Sophie happy birthday from all of us at New Forms Press and joining the Scholar Hangout today. And send us some pictures. Let's see them on social media if Sophie and her family are willing to share.
I'm going to take some great pictures today, and Sophie's mom says, please share my Sophie, so I know that you'll see them.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Well, everyone, thank you for joining us today. Again, this is Ph.D. Stephanie Mines. Stay tuned on the New Forms Press website to see more for research and tips for advocacy coming up. So, Stephanie, thank you, and I'll see everyone next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Catherine.